name is Harold Davis. I'm here to teach you about the art and craft of digital photography.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Harold Davis Studio in Berkeley, California. We are so pleased to have you with us today. Today's webinar is Mandalas and Patterns on the Lightbox. Many of Harold's most successful Lightbox images involve mandalas and patterned compositions. Mandalas are round, geometric figures thought to represent the world or universe in Hinduism and Buddhism. They also stand for the unity of self in Jungian psychology. We've been working hard this week making 2 videos that show the creation of mandalas using flowers, flower petals, and rocks. Really, you can make a mandala using materials you have right at hand. Feathers, rocks and pebbles, grasses and leaves, twigs, tissue paper flowers, and dried beans, just to name a few. Harold will show a selection of his mandala work and discuss how to make them and how to photograph them. Many of you know who Harold Davis is, but if you are joining us for the first time today, here's a little bit about Harold. Harold Davis is an artist, photographer, and author. His most recent book is Creative Garden Photography. Harold is the developer of a unique technique for photographing flowers for transparency and an innovator of digital multi-raw processing and hand HDR processing. Harold is an internationally known photographer. His prints are widely collected, and he is a sought-after workshop leader. He is a Moab Master and a Zeiss Ambassador. Harold's website is digitalfieldguide.com. Now I'll stop my share and hand it over to Harold.
Hi, everyone. This is a complicated presentation in that it has many moving parts, everyone. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with a couple of introductory slides. Then I'm going to share about, I don't know, somewhere between 50 and 100 mandala images that I've created on my Lightbox mostly. And I say mostly, you'll see what I mean, over the past, I don't know how many years. Then probably 5 to 10 years from, but the most recent as of yesterday. And then we have some movies to show you. I hope you have the popcorn ready. And then I'll come back to my slideshow and I'll go over exposing, processing, and LAB. For some of you, that's all going to be review because you've seen it before, or perhaps an introduction because there's a limit to what one can do. But I did want to at least touch on those topics. So without further ado or further ado, I'm going to share my screen. So this is about mandalas and patterns on the Lightbox. What I would say is that, as Phyllis said, first of all, anything can be grist for your mandala. You see, this one has a starfish in the center. If you're at a loss for how to begin one of these things, start with something in the center and go out from there with its spokes. The patterns part of it is there's a fine line between something like a spiral pattern and a mandala shape. This is creative garden photography, making great photos of flowers, gardens, and the beautiful world around us. And creative garden photography, as people who have the book know, has quite a bit of material on Lightbox photography, LAB inversions, and that kind of thing. It's my book where I treat on this subject matter most often. Here's creative black and white. And here's another book that Phyllis and I did. I think it's one of the ones we are truly proudest of. It's called Photographing Flowers. It was published by Focal Press, and I think it was about 8 to 10 years back, but it's still in print. Okay, a mandala, what is it? It's a circular pattern, sometimes thought to represent the universe, a sacred space, stands for wholeness, used for meditation. is immensely old as an artistic pattern, thousands and thousands of years old. One of the oldest abstract artistic patterns. From my viewpoint, I don't get too fancy. I don't get too caught up in does it represent Jungian, things like that. I look at it as a formal pattern. If the act of composition is framing something and your lightbox is your frame, then how are you going to present something within that frame that projects a wholeness and is whole in and of itself? So a circular mandala is a good answer to that. It's important in the mandala to have spokes going outwards as well as a potentially a central unit. Now I'm going to stop this slideshow and okay, here we go. So here's a mandala on a textured background. The sun or a sunflower is in the center. The yellow petals are sunflowers. The pinkish petals are roses, and it's got a frame within a frame. Within a frame, I used a Florabella texture, a tintype texture, to create the background frame there. I don't know, this is looking up at a Chinese pavilion in Golden Gate Park, but I thought it was a mandala shape, so I put it in. Here's something more like what we're going to show you today, with a pebble spiral, and then there are slices of fruit in the middle there. I see kiwi, radishes, all kinds of things, but mostly the spiral made up of the petal. This is apple slices and lemons, all of it around a piece of a single central apple. I like that one. Phyllis, what are these? These are radishes, right?
Yeah, they're purple daikon radishes.
Flower shape. And here's
Chioggia beets.
Can't be beat.
Tomatoes.
So, yeah, and those things are cucumber slices and kiwis.
Right, they were little Persian cucumbers, so they're very small.
And here they are again, and with onions this time. Earlier in the pandemic, I went through a sliced fruit and vegetable phase. This one is a mandala that always looked to me like a nuclear symbol or something, or a chemical one. This is the inside of a bowl, actually, so I bear limited responsibility for it, other than photographing it with a wide-angle macro lens stuck inside the bowl, so it makes a basic mandala shape. So I promise you some things that are not just Lightbox. Well, there you go. More fruits and vegetables. This is more like the kind of classical thing I do with dahlias from our pandemic dahlia bed and fuchsias from our pandemic fuchsia bed. And it was so much fun for us in the summer, growing all these flowers and then getting to photograph them. But what you can see here, depending on how you look at it, this is either a spiral shape or a mandala shape with the red in the center. And the two, of course, are related. Here's sort of a dried flower centered to this one with a ring of fuchsias around it. And not quite sure what this one is doing here, but it's a glass on a Lightbox and more glass on a Lightbox. So these shapes can actually be very simple. That in the center there, that's a monarda, a really wild flower. And again, all of these are from our pandemic gardens. The Gaillardia are the yellow ones. Symmetry is very important to the patterns here. So when you create these on a Lightbox, you want to make sure that you're thinking about the symmetrical patterns that are involved. Phyllis, while I have a sip of water, are there any questions I should address before I go on?
Oh yeah, Mary's wondering how big the Lightbox is that you're using.
No, my joke about that is that you can't be too thin, too rich, or have too big a Lightbox. So you measured it, this one. It's what, about 28 inches by 40 inches? Is that
I
about
think
right?
it's something like 28 by 36, something
I
like
think
that.
it's 28 inches by 36. But the best light box, as attributed to Jay Mizell, the best camera to use is the one you have with you. The best light box to use is the one you have. I've worked on small light boxes. I've worked on improvised light boxes. Two examples of that come to mind. One was at a photo workshop a few years back at Main Media, where they hadn't prepared a light box for me, and I found a studio LED light, which had the nice property that you could dial in the color temperature into it, and I used that as for a light box demo. It worked fine. In another workshop that I gave, my students came up with the idea of using an old piece of window glass with just a regular light bulb behind it and some paper to create the opacity, and that also worked pretty well too. But on our website, there's an FAQ with links to various kind of light boxes you can find, and as well as a plan for building your own light box. And the question of opacity and translucency is an interesting question. Here's a good image to talk about it with. This is a spiral of rocks, like one of the ones you're going to see in the movie, along with some hydrangea petals that we cut and plucked, or I did. I think not a trivial task, actually. The thing is that nothing is transparent. If something is 100% transparent, you don't see it. So what I'm really talking about are degrees of translucency. The amount of translucency that something has is going to depend on the backlighting and the exposure. So if you want something to be lit somewhat from the front as well, you have to control the lighting on the front. Usually I don't make too big a fuss about that. I use the ambient light where I am, and I like controllable window lighting from the sun best. But sometimes I will roll in an LED light or some other kind of light to light foreground items. Primarily, the thing with something like this rock spiral is that the exposure on the rocks is going to be very different than the exposure on the hydrangea petals if you want to capture the side of the rocks that are facing you, because if you expose for the hydrangea petals, they would go black. Can you use an iPad for your light box? From Melissa. That is an interesting question. I don't see why not. People have tried it, but it's not really big enough to be ideal, I think.
And Norman also has a question, if you don't mind, Harold.
Go right ahead.
Some of your items are opaque and some are transparent. How do you light the opaque items? You need some foreground light in addition to the light box, right?
Right. I kind of was addressing that before, but thank you, Norman. I mean, it just depends. If you have well, look, even a light box that projects light out is going to reflect back some light, depending where you're working, onto the front of the subjects. You can possibly use ambient lighting, but sometimes it makes sense to use additional lighting on the front of a subject. This one is a pretty classical wheel mandala image here. And again, you look at the symmetry, you can see the quadrants of this wheel are divided up, and it's what's in each is all pretty comparable. So there's at least a sense of symmetry, even if it's exactly symmetrical, not. One of my favorite quotations is that something like consistency is the hobgoblin of petty minds. So I don't pretend to try to be consistent with this, but I do pretend to try to mimic symmetry. So with this one, in the center starfish, and yes, the starfish is lit from the side facing the camera. It is an opaque object. You could never get translucent light through it anyhow. And then within the arms of the starfish, roughly speaking, are these quadrants of flowers. I think they're nemesias, and then they're petals of Alstroemeria in a ring around them. with the sort of branchy things going out between them, and then rose petals at the periphery. A pretty simple design, but a pretty effective mandala. And this one too, sort of this one I did as an autumn wreath basically, and it has a succulent in the center, which is unexpected. Grasses coming out of it, and then these maple leaves collected from a neighboring maple tree around it. Here you get an LAB inversion of a rather more complex. This one is almost entirely Alstroemeria petals. And here's the version photographed on the Lightbox. The thing about Alstroemeria petals is they are really, really good for translucency on a Lightbox, and they're these days very common flowers to get hold of. Peruvian lily is the common name. And a funny flower, as has been pointed out, human beings are the way that flower species propagate themselves, basically. Peruvian lilies originally came from a very small area in Peru, and they've been propagated all around so that people can enjoy them on their light boxes. This one's almost like a fireworks burst out of the center here. I don't know what I was thinking with that one. Here's the original of the fireworks burst on the Lightbox. Again, it's a sunflower surrounded by Alstroemeria petals. Note that the petals themselves have been picked. You'll see something of this in the movie that we're going to come up with pretty soon. The petals have been picked and sorted so that I can make a pattern out of the petals. Oh, this is the dome in Mosta on Malta, the island of Malta, looking up at it. So it's not really fair to put it here, but it is a mandala shape, basically. It's also one of the largest domes in the world. It was, and is noted for this miracle during the Second World War, where a German bomb, they dropped 3 bombs on it. 2 of them slid off harmlessly. 1 dropped through while a Christmas service was going on, sat right near the sanctuary, and didn't go off. The RAF was able to tote it away and sink it in the ocean, and they have a replica of this bomb in the sanctuary. And if you look really carefully at this mandala, you can see the patched hole where the bomb came through. So I think I've included these non-flower Lightbox images to say that this is a kind of universal shape that you can create out of many things, including crystal balls of images and so on. Here's a X-ray of a sunflower, basically nature's mandala shape. Another sunflower pattern like the one I showed earlier with spokes coming out of the sunflower. Jasmine stars around this one, which is a little unusual. White on white tends to present a bit of a problem, because if you're not careful, and even if you are careful, as you process the image, you can get the dread smudging effect. This becomes less of an issue if you put the image on a piece of scanned texture like here. Here's another oddball real life mandala. This is a fan photograph somewhere. And jasmine in our yard. These are sort of more expressionist mandala shapes. The next couple of ones, like this, is more like, it looks more like a colored ink and pen drawing than a photograph, and was processed to amplify that effect. This one's one of my favorite ones, most widely reproduced. It's got a proteus in the center and then Alstroemeria petals going out. Here's the original, also on textured paper. I'm talking too much. I need some water. So with this one, if you note, there's something weird going on here. If I call it myself, it's fractalized. So mandalas lend themselves to fractalization, to coin a word. The interior of this mandala is the mandala itself reproduced in Photoshop and put in the center of it. And here's an LAB inversion. This is very quadranted here. for me, creating these is fundamentally a kind of, you can think of it as doodling with flower petals, right, Phyllis? Here's a spiral. That was a rhetorical right, I guess. Here's a spiral. This one also widely reproduced, simple. And you can see LAB variations on the original of various sorts. So here's the original on the Lightbox. That's what it looked like. And just to back up for a second, here's, I think that's a LAB inversion, and this is an L channel inversion, which probably is the best of the lot of the LAB stuff on it. Here's a classical spiral just using two kinds of Alstroemeria petals. If you take apart the Alstroemeria petal, and the first of the videos that are coming up shows this a bit, there are two kinds of petals. They're the solid color petals, and they're what I call the tigers, these things. The tigers are the ones that are really special for Lightbox work. So just to back up for a second, here's the original on the Lightbox. Here's an LAB inversion of it. I like, you know, sometimes I present both because I like both, also because they're interesting as pairs, but this is an attempt here in Photoshop to combine a couple of different versions along with some compositing, along with, as you'll see, a couple of frogs in the bottom. Why not frogs? And this is really a double mandala here. I was experimenting with a more complex shape, more glassware. It's a nice dahlia. I called this one Dahlia Mandala. Here are two spirals together, which is something you can always do with spirals. Is first of all, as you'll see in one of the videos, you can experiment with flipping them, and you can also put two spirals together always. I started with a slide of the LAB of this. Here you go, this version. And here's one, another fairly widely reproduced one of mine. Gaillardia close up. This one is more a wreath form really than a mandala, but it does have the flower in the center, so it's fair enough to put it here. Again, this one's a pretty popular image of mine and a variation on it. And another variation of, this is simply a Proteus with a center, and I forget what that one was, but okay.
I think it was a jasmine, Harold. Like
honeysuckle. It's a honeysuckle. It's a honeysuckle
right?
flower. That's what it is. This is a honeysuckle flower. Are there any questions while
Yes, there are a few questions. I'm actually putting a link in the chat at the moment. The first question is from Lynn. What else besides museum wax do you use to fix the petals to your Lightbox?
You know, mostly, I don't think I used anything in anything I've shown you so far other than natural forces. But yeah, hold on a second, I got a can of something, I'll bring it over. I just don't remember what it's called, but I do use it sometimes. Give me a second.
Yeah, and Harold uses museum gel. It's clear, so that you can't see it if a little bit slurps out from underneath something.
Yeah, so this stuff is clear gel tacky glue, and it comes off, so it's good for light boxes, all purpose. It's basically clear. My recommendation though is to use friction, e.g. put things in place so they'll stay in place by themselves if possible. Sometimes that means shaving down the bottom of a flower so that it sits flat, or arranging it in some way so that it does. But I don't think anything I've shown so far has used any kind of glue. Not that not that there's anything wrong with it, or not that it's beyond me, and not that some of my Lightbox compositions don't. But on these, for the most part, the issue is the pattern of the thing itself. And thank you for a good question. I see. What is the inversion you're referring to? That means, swapping blacks for white using LAB color, and I've got a module at the end of this presentation on how to do it, as well as about some webinar recordings, as well as a webinar coming up. I don't remember on what date, but there's an essential creative LAB color coming up in sometime in January, which, by the way, leads me to point out that we are off webinaring for the remainder of 2020. So I'm going to, in advance and many times, wish everyone as best a vacation as possible under the circumstances, and say it's been a heck of a year, and let's expect and hope 2021 to be a better year.
Oh,
it will be.
Mary has a question too. How much time do you have to work with the petals before they dry out?
Yeah, it's a great question. Not long enough would be the short answer. A longer answer is that sometimes, and you'll see a few of them at the end of this part of the presentation, I photograph dried petals too. So drying out isn't necessarily the end of the world. It's going to depend on the flower, its moisture content, how long it's under the heat of a light box, because that makes some difference, and the moisture content of where you're working. If you take time to take the flowers off and use a sprayer and spray them down as you're working, you have a little longer, but I mean, somewhere between a half hour and 4 or 5 hours, probably toward the shorter end of that. An hour or two is really the answer. And that can be a problem because some of these compositions really do take a long time to arrange. And by the time you're at the end, they're almost drying out. So a great question. It is really one of the limiting factor for a lot of these. Are there other questions, Phyllis?
Vicki would like to know, is the 50 millimeter lens used for most of these?
Yes. That's a great question. Fun, and I do also have a short unit on the photography of these that we'll get to too. But yes, generally I use the Zeiss Otis 50 millimeter f1.4. I recommend roughly a 50 millimeter prime lens. Prime lens means it's not a zoom lens. The reason that zoom lenses are problematic is that many of them have something called zoom creep. Namely, they don't stay where you put them on the focal length. So that can truly screw up, a technical term, screw up a multi-shot Lightbox piece of work. If you only have a zoom lens, tape it down or use it at a focal length where it doesn't creep when pointed down. Note that these are not macro photographs with some exceptions. I have done some Lightbox work. Mostly these are not mandalas, which are macro photographs, and mostly for those I use something like an 85 millimeter macro lens or 100 millimeter macro lens straight down. The reason for 50 millimeters is basically process of elimination. If you use a wide angle lens down on a Lightbox, you're going to get too much of the room around the Lightbox. If you use a telephoto lens straight down on a Lightbox, the geometry, the inevitable geometry gets in the way. You'd have to be above your roof probably to get the whole Lightbox. You just can't fit it in the normal height of a room. And frankly, the less I have to go up a ladder to do these, the happier I am. Although sometimes I do have to go up a ladder. Anything else?
Yeah, Lorraine is wondering, what are these flowers? They're gorgeous.
This one here is clematis in the center, jade on the outside, and dahlias for the orange stuff. Again, all from our garden.
Oh, and Chris has a suggestion about the zoom lens. If you need to use a zoom lens, gaffer tape works well to hold the zoom.
Yeah, Chris is absolutely right. That's a good way to go. And but with two notes. One is that gaffer tape works well for just about everything, and the other is that your lens may get a little sticky if you do too much of that. Truly, a prime lens is the way to go here. They're optically good, and as lenses go, they're among the less expensive lenses you're likely to find. But you can only, if all you have is a zoom lens, well, so be it. And yes, then gaffer tape's good. And this is a clematis up close, this very same one, I think. And we have this one growing from a pot up our front gate out in the garden. another kind of image with a black velvet background. The orchids are in the bowl here, and here are ranunculi and tulips in a bowl. Back to Astromeria petals. And I'm not quite sure what that thing I put in the center was, but there it is. Here's another wreath shape with a dahlia in the center. And yeah, I did a transformation in the center. I put a ball in the center of this thing. I said, okay, if a mandala is the universe, let's have the solar system out there. And here, this is a basic quadrant shape wheel in the center. Petals, mostly Alstroemeria. The yellows are sunflowers. The pink are roses, is a rose. And one of the things you can think about is you don't have to photograph it just one way. I had this with a starfish in the center, something else in the center. Ultimately, I decided I liked it best really with nothing in the center. And here's a dried sunflower, dried flowers, dried clematis in the center, and petals. This is my dried sunflower on dark red velvet. You can't really see it, and we're getting up into the last few days here. So Phyllis, are you standby to project?
I am on standby, and
Cool.
Norman has a question too.
Go ahead, Norman.
Norman says, you say use the Zeiss 50mm, not a macro lens. Is there a good reason for this rather than a Zeiss 50mm macro lens?
Well, Norman, a lens is like a photographer's paintbrush, and they do different things. I happen to own the 50mm macro Zeiss lens as well. And in fact, it's really one of my walkabout lenses. It's not that heavy, and as Zeiss lenses go, it's also not that expensive, and it's a great macro lens. So I like using it. There's a lightness to the rendition that the Otis gives that isn't quite there in the macro lens. And on the other hand, if I wanted to take something at macro distances, I would use the macro lens. They're just two slightly different paintbrushes, but use what you have. My position in this is not quite fair as somebody who is a Zeiss lens ambassador. I'm not paying for these lenses, so I've got a lot of them, and that's a good position to be in. They are beautiful, beautiful, beautiful glass. But if you had to say, okay, I can only buy one lens and I want it to be a good one, well, you do very well with the Zeiss 50mm macro, and sure, you can use that for Lightbox work. I certainly have from time to time. For example, when I've done Lightbox work with my friend and photography partner, Dr. Kopfka, in Germany, and I traveling to Germany, I don't carry the Otis with me to Germany. It's studio weight glass. I carry the Zeiss 50mm macro, and that's what I use for my fusion x-rays. So good question, no real answer. How about that? So here's a last image. I just finished this one yesterday. If you look at it carefully, you'll see that the bulk of these flowers, in fact, I think all of them, are dried flower petals. So that's interesting. It's something different. I had a lot of fun with this one. I liked it a lot. And basically, perhaps more like a spiral than a mandala. There are places you could go from here. You could make it into quotation marks. You could hook up one spiral to another. You could put an infinite fractal spiral in the center here, and so on. All right, before we switch off to our movies, are there any more questions?
I don't see anything popping up yet, but we'll give a minute for people to type something if there's anything they have.
Phyllis, in that case, you want to get started? Here's, I spoke about sorting the petals. Here you go. No, I need to play the next one, Phyllis.
Oh, okay. Here, I'll get the next one up. It'll take me a minute.
On that last point of, uh, I think it looks better flipped. You know, there's no saying that photographing it is going to be in the direction that you actually want to present the image, because the geometry of it is that you want to get the camera in the best position to be parallel to the image. Often that means, for example, shooting horizontally, or when you want it to be vertical, or even vice versa. I guess one thing I'd note about that video, looking at it, is that if we weren't doing it for the purpose of this webinar and for this capture, I probably would have extended the stone spiral further, because there was more room in the Lightbox, but we were limited by the camera capture for the video. So that's worth noting. It's also worth noting that one spiral at a time. So the way I did that was, as the movie showed, I created the stone spiral and then filled in the pattern, the repeating pattern really, of flowers around the stone. So the stones contrasted with the flowers. Just two of the materials you can use. You can do it with flowers, you can do it with anything else. All right, let me share my screen again.
Oh, and Rosalind has a question while you share.
Sure, go ahead.
She'd like to know, how many stops do you bracket?
Yeah, so we're just about to get there.
Patience, young Jedi.
Patience, young Jedi. But +4 -4 would be a good rule of thumb. So 8 stops, which is 2 to the 8th, which is 64 times from shortest to longest. I mean, your camera is going to screw you your camera is not going to get this right if you leave it on an automatic exposure mode. It's painfully clear that it doesn't, because what happens if you tell the camera to do an average exposure or a matrix metering blend or anything like that of a comparatively dark object on a white background? It's going to make the object go dark and try to expose for the white. So here's the 10-cent version of exposing, 5-cent version. Create a white background, set 7 to 10 exposures, start completely overexposed, manual exposure, bracket shutter speeds, 1 EV increments, and stop when you get to the dark side. So a couple of slides further on will show you what I mean by that a little more. And reserve an HDR blend. So what I do is I run the 7 to 10 exposures, let's say 8 exposures, through a automated HDR program, e.g. the one in Photoshop or Lightroom or Aurora or Nik HDR FX or whatever. And I put that aside when I'm making my layer stack. And the photographing flowers on a Lightbox sequence of webinars that as I mentioned, I'm going to be starting up again in January, go through all this in a great deal of detail. The last time around, it ended up being 5 Lightbox webinars, basically to cover the material, with 2 about doing it in 3D, so 7 altogether. Since I think many of the people who are signed up for it have a bit of background with this by now, maybe we'll be able to do it with a few less, but it does take a bit. This is, while it's funny because this is both a very home-brewed technique and you don't need a lot of elaborate equipment, so it makes it good for sheltering in place in that respect. But also, it does take a bit of sophistication in processing the exposures to get it really just the way we like it. So, underexposure histogram, that's what it looks like. Overexposure histogram, roughly speaking, that's what it looked like. All, you never really see this nominal bell-shaped curve in a histogram. And in fact, since what a histogram is a bar graph representing the black. An exposure histogram is a bar graph representing the black and white values of what the camera is seeing out there. Actually, the way this curve looks is going to depend on what's out there. And primarily, the histogram of a Lightbox photo is going to look like a rising curve way at the right white and not much else. But all we care about here are the things to the right of the dashed line, so more overexposed than normal. That's why stop when you get to the dark side. You don't care about anything that goes over into the beyond the normal range. You actually don't even really care about up to the normal. You're mostly looking for overexposed stuff. So here in a sequence of photos, here's a dahlia at 4 seconds. Here's the darkest, I think it was the 30th of a second. Here are all the exposures in a bridge shown from 4 seconds on the upper left to a 30th of a second on the second row. And again, on the 30th of a second exposure, you'll see that these backlit dahlias, there may be a little light in the front, but not much. This is what the camera says should be exposed. Okay, the camera does not know what it's talking about here. You are smarter than the camera. Okay, that's the way my final version of this composition came out. So if you've done that with, let's say, your 8 brackets, 1 EV apart, for post-production, you start with the most overexposed, you process each through Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw with the same settings, and then you add the darker images with layering, layer masks, and the brush tool. And at the end, you might add the HDR on top if you want to give it a little extra punch. So here's a layer stack in Photoshop showing that kind of progression. It's sort of, sometimes I liken this to a wedding cake, where you know how wedding cakes get sort of thinner and smaller toward the top. Well, the darker you get on this thing toward the top, the less you put in. So down at the bottom, and the 4 second is at about 100%, and maybe the 2 second is at about 100%, and selectively the 1 second is about 100%. And then as you go up into the half a second and less duration of time, you get lesser percent down to maybe 30% at the way top. And as you can see in the layer stack here, the HDR is at the top. So here are just some inspiration for Lightbox images that are not mandalas. This is the cover image for the Creative Garden photography book. And it was funny, the publisher picked this image and they said, Harold, they usually go through a routine with us where Phyllis prepares half a dozen images, and we always know that we better be prepared to live with anything we give them. So we're careful about it because you never know what they're going to pick. And they picked this one. They said, it's very bright and cheerful. And I said, fine, we like it too. It's a nice wraparound cover. And they said, great, Harold, but you are going to say how to make the image in the book, aren't you? So that meant I had to go and write this stuff up. So a number of questions on here about LAV inversions. an important set of techniques. Again, we have a lab color webinar coming up at the end of January, I think. This is a diagram that bears more talking about and thought, but the gist of it here is when you're working, a color space is a definition of how you define the colors within a space. The wider gamut the color space is, the more colors can be defined in that space. CMYK is a very different way of defining color than RGB. CMYK is typically used for things like printing books. RGB is used for things like showing up on monitors typically. sRGB is the smallest well-known RGB space. It's the worst color space known to personages. So it's what most of your JPEGs are going to be saved on the internet in, and it's not capable of very much color rendition. ProPhoto RGB is the widest gamut commonly used RGB color space. LAB color is a theoretical color space created by a consortium of physicists that is wider gamut than any of these other color spaces, and it includes the mathematical definitions of colors that can neither be rendered nor reproduced. So the question then is, what the heck do you do with it? In Photoshop, essentially what you've got in LAB color are channels like this for LAB. And so probably you are most familiar with RGB color. So if you've looked at that in Photoshop, there's a thing called the channels panel, which has sliders for each of the channels. If you look at LAB color in Photoshop and open up the channels panel, you'll see sliders for these three channels, the L, A, and B, which is where the LAB comes from. There are two interesting properties here which can be used to create the kind of effects that you've seen in my images. And one is that the black and white information in the L channel, the lightness channel, as it's sometimes called, is completely separate from the color information. So that means you can flip white for black, like in the images where you saw me doing this with the backgrounds, using one adjustment. You select the L channel, and then in Photoshop, you go image, adjustment, invert, and that flips blacks for whites and whites for black. And this is also taking advantage of what I said was the second of two interesting properties of the LAB channels, and that is that they are color opponent. Each channel contains the color involved and its opposite. So with the black and white channel, that would be white to black and black to white, and with the A channel, that's green to magenta and magenta to green, and with the B channel, that's yellow to blue and blue to yellow. So you can do all kinds of things. Here is an example using a bougainvillea bract of a bunch of different LAB channel inversions, and you can see how groovy some of these effects are. It's like Andy Warhol on steroids, maybe. And you know, you can start with something like this. This is a semi-abstract macro of paper bark tree bark. And here we go, running it through some LAB variations, and you go to this, and finally you can come out with something like this. So learning to master this is quite an unusual thing, and I'm going to leave you with that taste. Here's the discount code for creative garden photography and the discount code for creative black and white. And here's how to reach me. Please send me your mandalas on a Lightbox or otherwise. I'm going to hold up a season's greeting slide with "Onward to the light at the end of the tunnel," and see you in 2021. I'm doing a free webinar, I think it's on January 2nd, to greet the new year, showing in-camera multiple exposures with models, and that should be a lot of fun. Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Phyllis, anything else, or should I say goodbye? Tell me to say goodbye. Say goodbye, Harold.
I just put the link to upcoming webinars, your upcoming live webinar page in the chat. So if anyone wants to take a look at all the webinars you've been mentioning. Good. And Linda says, thanks again for another wonderful webinar. And
thank you, Linda.
Yeah. And Larry says, happy holidays. And thanks for the webinars. Kim says, thank you. Norm says, this has been very educational, inspiring. Thanks. Thank you, Norman.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. And please have a great, great, great holiday. We should do the best we can in these times and hang in there together. And photography helps me. It really does. And I hope it has the same benefit for you. And goodbye, Harold. Oh, goodbye.
I hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. Be creative and stay mighty.